Good afternoon, and welcome to TIA's live stream discussion to explore the Federal Communications Commission's newly adopted Order on Equipment Authorization. We're going to dive into the agency's new electronic labeling and device certification rules for telecommunications equipment and seek to better understand how it will benefit regulators, manufacturers, and consumers alike. I'm Dilip Shrihari with the telecommunications industry, and with me today in the TIA Now studio to help us unpack the new order is Julie Knapp, Chief of the FCC's Office of Engineering and Technology, and Rashmi Doshi, Chief of the FCC's Office of Engineering and Technology Laboratory Division. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
So I wanted to mention to our to our viewers up front that this is a live question and answer session that will happen at the end of this segment. So viewers can submit their questions for Julie and Rashmi now and throughout the program in the question box below this video. So Julie, to start off, just in a high-level sense, what exactly does the new FCC report and order on equipment authorization do?
So thanks, Dilip. I should start by saying that we've actually had our equipment authorization program in place for, I mentioned in our presentation at the Commission, close to 50 years. And its objectives are both to make sure that the products comply with our technical rules, so there's not interference between the different services, and also to enable us to move product into the market quickly so innovation can happen. And over the years, we've made a number of changes to try and best meet those goals as the technology has evolved and the circumstances have changed. And so this order was the latest iteration of that. And so it covered basically four broad areas. One, that we combined two self-approval processes that were similar, but could easily be confused as to which process would apply to what product and so forth. And then the second thing that we addressed was electronic labeling, which we've actually had started to do on the basis of some interpretations from our staff over the last couple of years. And now we've amplified that and put it into our rules so it's absolutely clear what people would be able to do. We've also had an importation form, 740, that's been in place for a number of years, but it really is no longer an effective way to monitor compliance. And then lastly, what we did is update the measurement procedures and a couple of other rules to bring them up to date with the latest testing methods.
Great. Well, let's maybe start with e-labeling for the first part of our conversation. It's an issue that has been important to TIA members, I think, for a long time. And I think TIA was involved in getting a bill through Congress, the E-Label Act, that actually was influential on your actions in this proceeding. So can you just give us a quick overview of what e-labeling really is and maybe some examples of that?
So, you know, having been involved very early in my career with the equipment authorization program, you know, from the early days we required paper labels on every product, and then we moved to permanent labels, metal labels, and even things being etched into the products. But times have changed, and people look for information on their devices that have video displays, whether these are smartphones or tablets or even PCs. So what we've tried to do here is, rather than requiring a permanent label, which actually is pretty costly to update with every product, to allow the information we put in, for example, with the same places as you have the user manual and the other compliance information. So we've really tried to take advantage of the technology, help reduce costs, provide flexibility for that. And maybe Rashmi can give you a couple of other examples for where that comes into play.
Sure.
Right. So historically, e-labels were allowed in our software-defined radios and modular devices. However, in fact, it started with TIA, TRPC actually requesting that we expand the program, and we started doing that even before the E-Label Act was adopted. And the idea was that there are more and more screen-based devices, and there is a much easier way to display information to the user than just a simple FCC ID and connecting and that. So what we have done here is really codify what used to be in our guidance documents, what was required by the E-Label Act, and actually try to provide a basis on which we can build additional interpretations as we go along, as the new technologies come in, so that this will help to create a baseline in terms of our capabilities that we can allow the manufacturers to take advantage of.
You mentioned codification. So e-labeling was actually in some form allowed through informal FCC guidance before that. What about putting it into the rules now is different, and what's the advantage of doing that?
So we took a number of things. First of all, when we give a guidance, it's always a staff interpretation. And there's always a limit in terms of how far staff can interpret the rules. Once it's in the rules, it takes a much stricter, much greater weight in terms of how people can apply them. The other thing is it gives staff an additional level beyond what we were able to do to now actually be able to interpret on a case-by-case basis if there is a need where e-labels may be appropriate.
Great, and you mentioned also about screen-connected devices. I just want to drill in on that a little more deeply, if I could, so that people actually understand what we're talking about and maybe what devices we're not talking about. So by screen-connected, aside from my iPhone, or are we talking about set-top boxes like Apple TVs and Rokus, or health monitoring devices, or those kinds of devices? What exactly is screen-connected?
So this was one of the difficult areas that one of the things that we had anticipated to do, and this allows the staff to kind of go beyond what was allowed in the initial KDB guidance. So there are two concepts in the rules. One is integrated screen and other is screen connected. Integrated screen, everybody knows, smartphones, tablets are all integrated screens. It's part of the device. Screen connected devices are essentially like set-top boxes and others, where you need a display, but it's not part of it device. And there was actually a number of times requests coming in that we should be able to allow that. So the rule now sets a baseline standard for staff to allow essentially devices like set-top boxes. There are also some remote devices that can only operate unless with an app, for example. And so in cases where device needs that app in order to operate, but the app is on a smartphone or something, we would be able to allow e-label and information to be displayed accordingly.
Great. So I'm sure there are some exceptions that exist under the new rules. I think medical devices, rescue beacons, some other types of devices. Can you talk a little bit about those exceptions and why those are in place?
So as we were going through, and for people, this is probably on one hand a very esoteric topic and very mundane. On the other hand, it's critical because it's a fairly product impacting. As we went through our rules, and this is a comprehensive review of all our rules across, where we have requirements for FCC ID information, user information, information that needs to be provided on a warning basis. So we kind of looked at it and said, what do we need to do to be able to allow this information to be provided electronically? E-labeling rules now will allow a lot of this information to be provided electronically. But certain information like warning labels that really require a user to take action or be careful before they even turn on the device, we felt that were not suitable for e-label, because by the time you turn on the device and look at it and others, you already passed potential warning requirements. So we have identified several rules where that information needs to be provided on the surface, or at least with the device itself.
Yeah, take for example, an emergency position radio beacon. When the emergency happens, someone can't be looking for where it is in the label. They need to see it right on the outside. So that's kind of an example of the sort of thing where we said, you need to know this before you even turn it on.
Right. Speaking of other types of devices like this, maybe extremely small devices. What about Bluetooth headsets or the docks that they plug into? When you think about the labels that are etched on the back of your phone, and maybe those devices not having screens or having maybe very small screens, how do those play into the rules?
Well, there are two different issues there again. One is that there are small devices, and we actually crafted in the rules a specific set of descriptions on how far small devices need to be in before the labels can be. It doesn't have to be on a screen, because if the device is small, the likelihood is that it doesn't have a screen anywhere. And in that case, we have already allowed for devices to place the labels in a packaging and a user manual. But if the device does operate with another one, as I said, there's a part of a screen to manage it, then you could use an app to have the e-label in. Bluetooth docks kind of come in different flavors. It's all kinds of different types of Bluetooth device. There are Bluetooth pods or earbuds. We've seen some of them can place the labels if they are. Currently, the rules define if you can put the label that's smaller than 4 points, then it's too small to read, and you can put it in packaging. But if it is more than 4 points in size, and obviously not squished up with all the different descriptions, then you need to put it on the device itself. And so that's the sort of line that's drawn in the rules right now.
Great. Let's talk about this in a practical sense. If I'm trying to find the new label, or I need to find the new label on my device if it's not on the back anymore, we understand there's a new 3-step rule that's in the order in terms of how this means. What does that actually mean in terms of finding the label on my phone or on my Apple TV? How does that work?
Actually, it's not a new rule. This was proposed by TRPC that we adopted in our initial guidance. In fact, TRPC came up with the idea when we were initially investigating the idea of there is a balance between allowing information to be placed electronically and being reasonably easy to access. Because as everybody knows, on a computer, you can spend time through 10 layers of menu before you find your information, because typically users give up looking for it. The 3-step process was essentially in our KDB guidance that we codified. And the idea was that typically most people will go to their home screen or a settings menu or configuration menu, that it should be 3 steps once you got at that particular level of display. If anybody has an iPhone, actually iPhone has probably a good example. You go to your settings menu, go down to regulatory information, and the next level is actually all the information. I'm not plugging iPhone, but at least as an example that kind of shows you that the other thing that the rules made it clear that typically people need to access the screen through a security mechanism, codes or others. That's not part of the 3-step. You have to be at your home screen as if you're normally using it, and then the 3 steps would be counted.
Terrific. So moving beyond e-labeling maybe to some of the other elements that were in the report and order. So it makes significant changes in the device approval process. And specifically, my understanding is there's a new self-approval process on Supplier's declaration of conformity. So what exactly is that? What is the new process, sort of at a conceptual level, regarding self-approval that the FCC has put in place in this order?
Sure. And maybe if you'll just indulge me for a minute, for how did we wind up with 2 self-approval processes in the first place? Quite a while ago, we had products that were subject to certification, third-party review, and at that time they were only approved by our laboratory, and a self-approval process for things that had digital electronics in them but hadn't had a track record of causing interference, hadn't been problematic. And for about 10, 12 years, we were certifying all personal computer equipment, the desktops, the laptops, and the printers and the mice. We had reached a point where we felt not as much of a problem as it had been originally, but we still felt the measurement procedures weren't quite as clear. So we created this other process called the Declaration of Conformity that was still a self-approval process, but the major difference was you had to use an accredited lab. And part of the reason for an accredited lab for those products was people were still trying to understand the measurement procedures. And I think we weren't quite ready enough to reduce the level of oversight of the testing. So now fast forward. personal computer equipment and digital devices have been on the market for a long time. Laboratories know how to do the tests. Industry has done a fabulous job in defining the measurement procedures. So what we've essentially done now is we just have two processes. Certification is for the products where there's a greater potential of interference. The complexity of the testing can be greater and so forth. And so there's a third-party review, and all of that now is being done through the telecommunications certification bodies. The second process is self-approval. And so we combine these processes into one. We didn't feel that it was any longer necessary to maintain the lab accreditation requirement because the products in these categories generally had not caused problems. People understood how to do the testing and so forth. And it seemed to us a much simpler way to construct the program, to boil it down from two self-approval products and trying to decide which one do I fall into or not, into just these two categories. So we tried to take the best of each and putting them together, and that was our objective.
So just so I understand, are we talking here about devices that are essentially not designed to be transmitting radio waves? I think you call them unintentional radiators under rules, like microwave ovens or a monitor that doesn't have a transmitting radio in it. That's what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost all radio transmitters are subject to certification.
Right.
And these are products, technically anything that has digital electronics in it, except for things that, there's a few things we've excluded or extremely low power, are subject, they still emit unintentionally, so we've got to make sure that they don't interfere, but the risk isn't as great. And so that's primarily what falls into this supplier's declaration of conformity process.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, things like receivers, TV receivers, radio receivers, switching power supplies. I mean, a lot of these kinds of things now will be under one category of supplier's declaration of conformity. And as Julie said, we kind of took parts of our old verification procedure and the parts of the declaration of conformity and tried to bring those together in terms of what we thought were relevant parts to incorporate in the self-declaration. For people who have been doing declaration of conformity, this would look very similar. And primarily we hold the responsible party to ensure that they get the test done properly, keep the records associated with that particular testing in case there is inquiries, and include a compliance statement that's appropriate according to the rule parts in the user's manual or user's information. One of the other things, we kind of made it consistent, which wasn't clear between the verification and the DOC procedures, was to ensure that there is a proper identification of the product name and model number, so that if we need to or the user needs to, we can actually do some tracking and finding the information about the product.
So was the rationale for this change, was it primarily that the technologies were actually, devices were being made better, or is it more that just after time passed there was a better understanding of what the interference potential of these devices was?
Actually both, and the third is, as they said, we were getting a lot of questions all the time in terms of which process do I use and why would it be different than others. So I think it was again trying to look to see, we need to streamline this. Technology is merging. A lot of times we get in my job, I get all kinds of questions coming up. I said, if I have a USB interface, is it a computer peripheral or is it only doing something simple? Now, things like USB interfaces, if it's only used for charging, we said, no, that's for verification. If it transfers data, it's for DOC. This way, we don't need to make that kind of parsing of the same device and depending on what it's doing. And
I just amplify what Rashmi said. Take an MP3 player, for example. And if it has no connectors on it, it's a digital device, it would have been verified. If it puts a USB port on it, it's a computer peripheral. Had to be under the Declaration of Conformity. Now you had to use an accredited lab. If it had a Bluetooth in it, then it had to be certified. So that's the kind of confusion we were trying to reduce.
Right. So of course, moving to another topic, a lot of devices, of course, are manufactured outside of the United States, and they're imported into the United States. So FCC Form 740, I think, is something that a lot of manufacturers would be familiar with. One of the big changes, I think, in this order is that that form is going away. So can you talk a little bit about what that document used to do, and maybe what the rationale is for making a significant change on that front?
All right.
So let me start, because I was there at the start of it. So in the earlier days of this equipment certification program, products would come into the country, and often we had about 1,000 forms a month for the products that were coming in that would be shipped to us through customs. And with the staffing we had at the time, and it was a reasonable number, you were able to review them. And I still recall the days where we'd say, okay, these 50, we don't have a record of this identification being certified, tell customs to hold the product. But now just about everything has got a radio in it, and there's millions of products that come in each month. And so just trying to sift through all of that is much more resource intensive. Couple that with, we have today resources like the internet, or working with, sometimes we'll get complaints, to track down things that maybe came into the country that shouldn't have. And we have a good working relationship with customs. So we can work with them if we recognize that there's a problem, to keep products from coming into the country that shouldn't.
Great. Sorry, did you want to?
No, I just wanted to add that, in fact, there are a couple of other things that also happen about the same time. Customs has gone through a completely new database, electronic data collection database, in terms of collecting information that they need to do routinely for their own purposes. And we now have an agreement with the customs so that we'll be able to access that database if we have any kind of issues or inquiries. So instead of collecting the information per individual device, we are now able to actually go and look at and review the data coming in through the customs.
So of course, tying this topic back to where we started with e-labeling.
Right.
So our understanding is that you had to spend some time and had to meet with a number of stakeholders to try and figure out, how does e-labeling work in the context of customs inspections and devices coming into the country. So what kind of a solution did you ultimately come up with on that front?
Right. So one of the biggest concern that both customs and our enforcement division has is that if a device doesn't have a label, how do we know when it's imported that the device complies with our rules? And people will be surprised, but customs do look at boxes coming in on an audit basis and others to ensure that the devices do certify. And we do work with customs quite often to hold importation if it doesn't necessarily have the appropriate label. So that became a big issue. The second piece was that a lot of times the customers who are looking for information also want to know what device FCC IDs are. So what we came up with the idea originally in our KDB guidance was that you had to put a temporary label right on a stick-on label. We, based on the industry comments, stakeholder discussions, and others, generally agreed that perhaps that was adding an expense. But on the other hand, we now would allow for this kind of temporary information, but very clear identification of the product, a website or web page link where it perhaps the information about the compliance and others is clearly accessible, so that customs, when they look at the device and the model number and others, are able to go and review that the information is available. And so we would allow for these kinds of packaging information or any other information that could be provided to both the customs and the users. We still have the issue when our enforcement bureau goes out and wants to be able to identify a product. And one of the things that we require that there should be some kind of identifier in the product model number, product model, who manufactures it, so that they can still go to a website and look for the information associated with that. So this is the whole idea of temporary packaging information and temporary information. We expanded beyond what we had given in our earlier KDB guidance.
So one of the issues I know a few of our companies are interested in is, as they're marketing their devices, trade shows. And being able to import a certain number of devices for trade show purposes, and I think that number maybe was changed in the order. And so, what was the rationale there, and how did you come up with the number?
So there were in our rules we had two different categories of devices in terms of numbers. About 3 years ago, when we changed our previous rules, we changed the number for licensed devices, but we didn't change the number for our unlicensed devices. And so this was more a correction on our side, recognizing that increasingly we have both licensed and unlicensed devices coming together. And so we generally made a blanket common number for a device irrespective of whether they're licensed or unlicensed, or whether they're mixed in one device. We would still treat it as a one device and allow for trade show purposes.
Right. So sort of towards the end of the order, kind of harking back to a procedural process thing we were talking about earlier, there are some other changes where the FCC now is including in rules more references to the OET knowledge database than it did before. So can you just explain again what sort of the rationale is for, beyond e-labeling, what the desire is to put more of that into the rule text as opposed to putting things in the KDB?
So, and having watched where we came from, where a company would write a letter to us or send an email saying, I want an interpretation of, and they might get a response back and the letter would go into the file, and we had attorneys throughout Washington who would come and copy all of the responses to find out what was going on. The technology moves so fast now that we need to be able to adapt. Here's what the rules say and the intention of the rules, and how to apply it to any given situation. And by recognizing this in the rules itself, it basically acknowledges this process that we have in place, and it's interactive. So, particularly for significant issues where, from the day where we'd write a question, we'd give an answer, a thoughtful answer, but there was no really opportunity for dialogue. Now we'll get a question, we'll put out a draft answer for how we're going to handle something, and we'll get feedback before we finalize it. So it was primarily to recognize that process and the benefits of it and the importance of it to making sure that innovative products get to market quickly.
Great. Just talking a little bit about going forward from the actual adoption of this order, are there transition periods involved, or is this new process basically effective immediately?
Right. So there are a couple of different transition periods involved. First is obviously we need to get the order published in the Federal Register.
Any idea when that's going to happen?
I wish I had a wand, but unfortunately I don't. And as people, you regulatory folks will appreciate, we have to go through an OMB approval process as well. So we are hoping it's not too long, but it will be fairly soon. So the rules will be effective on the day that it's published in the Federal Register. For this, the self-authorization, self-declaration of conformity, people can follow self-declaration of conformity immediately, or for verification and DOC, the old self-authorization procedures, there is a one-year transition. So that people can have 1 year to either continue to comply with the old rules or apply the new rules. Most of our rules are what we call relaxation, in the sense that we are more permissive. So we expect that there should not be any issue of wanting to apply them immediately. In terms of e-label, again, it's optional, it's not mandatory. And use of test procedures is also, again, optional in terms of getting started, but at least it will be incorporated by reference. And we already have issued KDBs that reference those test procedures.
So I think my final question before we go to the audience questions, we noticed this was the first report and order, and maybe there were some issues in the previous notice of proposed rulemaking that were not addressed in this order. So what are some of those issues, and what is the Commission's planned path forward for addressing them?
Yes. First, I assure you we have not forgotten about the other matters that were in there. I think we generally felt that they were a bit more complicated and needed a little bit more time to work through. And those included things like, well, how do we handle modules? And how do we handle this issue that I think got a lot of attention from folks about software control of the radio without interfering with the benefits of software for creating mesh networks, for improving the performance of the radio, for upgrading security and so forth. So we're still working on those issues. I don't want to give you a specific time yet, but it won't be that long before we get to the remaining issues.
Great. Well, I think we have some great questions from the viewers that have been coming in. So the first question is, it's clear that the new rules are intended to impact consumer devices. The question is, do the new rules also impact industrial devices that are intended to be sold from business to business or for industrial manufacturing purposes?
I think while there's a great advantage for the consumer devices, the rules don't differentiate between industrial and consumer devices. So in fact, all the rules apply to the industrial devices as well. So I'm not sure where the distinction is, but at least from the applicability, the rules should apply to both consumer and industrial products.
So here's another great one. Under the new SDOC process, can a manufacturer still choose to put the FCC logo on the label, because some countries outside the United States might actually be looking for that?
Yeah, and in fact, if you ever get a chance to read the discussion in the order, we went to some lengths to try and actually recognize that FCC logo is useful, even though we felt that perhaps making it mandatory was too much of a burden. We do recognize that other countries and other people do use the FCC or rely on FCC logo. So we have made that optional. Allow people to use it with the condition that it cannot be just used as a replacement for some of the compliance information. The compliance and the testing has to be performed, but the use is optional.
Great. Here's one looking internationally again. An international e-labeling standard has recently been proposed. Do you foresee sort of future FCC interaction with that idea through a standards body or with other countries on this issue?
Actually, that's a great point. Through Department of Commerce and USTR, we are working with a number of countries to see how the common approaches to the e-label would work. In fact, there is APEC is sponsoring an e-label conference in August where we will be presenting some of the things that we are doing and looking for and some cooperation through different organizations. So we already talked to Canada on some of the things that they're doing. So yes, I think we'd be sort of trying to get to some common ideas would be definitely very useful.
I'd just add that I think we're on the forefront in this area worldwide. And I know when I go to places like Europe or Asia, we're always trying to inform people about what we've done in the hope that they will follow what we've set as an example.
There have been some more far-reaching proposals, some of our viewers point out, to move all of the information to the manufacturer's website. What do you think about that?
Actually, again, to the extent that under the new rules, there is information that could be placed on the manufacturer's web pages. And the question that becomes is how easy it's to access and whether it's easy to be provided locally in terms of what the user is looking for rather than have to go to a website for a connected basis. But actually, the new rules do allow for some flexibility.
So here's a more technical one. I'm going to read this to make sure I'm getting it right. If an integrated screen device or a device which can only be used with a screen, which would otherwise be allowed under e-labeling, also includes a personal locator beacon, would it still fall under the exception to e-labeling?
You know, I'm trying to imagine what kind of device that is. But look, first of all, because we have the KDB process, if somebody has a question like that, they can send it into the lab and then they can take a look and say, okay, this is what it is. So you can imagine if you've got an EPIRB on a ship that for whatever reason has also got a screen display, I have to think if I were looking use that EPIRB for some reason, I'd want to know as easily as possible.
Yeah.
But that's just a guess.
Well, we can't address the EPIRB. I will address that if you are an angler and you have a fish finder, a fish finder which requires an app to run with it will be allowed.
Great. So you mentioned testing at the lab. This question, I think, is about the FCC's work. How will OET handle the increasingly software-centric test and certification requirements of radio systems that are coming to the Columbia labs?
Yeah.
That's why we haven't done the second order report and order. I think that's part of the work for the second.
But I would just also interject that I think from the days long ago where we had a radio that was the sum of the parts and operated in one band and you couldn't change it, to today where we have systems with 9 and 10 radios in them, software controlled. The balancing we're trying to achieve is that you still meet the technical requirements, but you're not doing 2,000 tests so that by the time you're done, the product is outdated. And that really is the challenge that we have, is both driven in part by the software, but just the complexity of the equipment.
So just as we're closing here, what do you hope for at this point as a reaction from the ICT manufacturing community? What more input do you need as the process go forward? What are you looking for from industry to continue to help you guys do your jobs?
So first of all, I want to thank TIA, and there are other organizations out there that have worked with us through the years, and I hope folks understand that our door is always open to ideas, and we take them seriously. I think we still have things to tackle ahead that we mentioned. The modules comes to mind in particular. What do we do about the software relative to radios? And the emphasis there, primarily because as we're moving to more sophisticated sharing systems, people need to have confidence that the software that's running the radios won't be hacked and cause major problems. So I think there are, my hope is that folks see these as positive steps, and that we continue to have a dialogue as we work through the ever-changing evolution of the technology.
Great. Well, I just want to say thank you so much to Julie and to Rashmi for coming today. We really appreciate you taking some time. And TIA has worked with you for years on these issues and will continue engaging with you on these issues. So we just want to say we appreciate all of the work that goes into getting one of these report and orders out, and for coming today to talk to all of the people in our manufacturing community that are watching today. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.